Father, we thank you for this day. We are mindful that each and every day is a beautiful gift from you, just for life itself. May we never forget that you have placed us here for this moment in history. May we bring your light and hope to this dark and broken world. Wherever our area of influence is, maybe our family, our neighbors, wherever it might be, I pray that you will use us in a mighty way. We thank you for Jeffrey and Dolly and this ministry, for the Areopagus and how it has trained and equipped so many of us with more confidence to go into the world, knowing your truth and sharing that truth with those around us. May we continue to bring that light and hope. And I pray your blessing on Jeffrey tonight and anyone else who might be bringing these articles, their presentations to us. We are so thankful that we live in a country where we're free to worship you, meet like this, speak your name, and just so many, many blessings that we have. And as I started, for life itself. And we thank you and ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
I'm going to pass the speed around this song. Okay, that's just to have you all check your names off, and if you're not on the list, just write your name somewhere on the list.
Okay, well, Millie, thank you very much for your comments and the opening prayer, and it's very good to see those of you who are joining us online, and very much looking forward to our session this evening. Now, as we had mentioned last week, tonight, it'll be a little different from most of our classes. We're going to have 4 individuals each address one of these articles in the back of the C.S. Lewis study guide. And we're going to start with Bruce Phillips, who will be doing a presentation on C.S. Lewis, an article called Jack the Giant Killer. Allegra Davis then will follow with C.S. Lewis for the Ages. Ali Harrelson will speak on C.S. Lewis, His Progress Possible, Willing Slaves of the Welfare System, one of Lewis's most explicit statements on politics and political theory, which he actually wrote more on politics than many people, even those who read a lot of his material, are aware. And then Karen Burgess will make the 4th presentation, and that will be on the article, How C.S. Lewis Predicted Today's College Campus Craziness. Now, I would assume that probably most of us watched at least some of the State of the Union address last night. And it was certainly a stark reminder to me of just how divided this nation is politically. Now, in the Areopagus, we've never shrunk back from dealing with the whole realm of life issues, including politics and political theory and so on. And it reminded me of, and I'll read quickly here just a couple of passages out of my book, American Crisis, Cultural Marxism and the Culture War, A Christian Response. And in this book, I addressed the current state of the Democratic Party. And I wrote, quote, in the previous chapter, I wrote about my disillusionment with America as a result of all the social, cultural, and political shock and awe of the 1960s and 70s. For many years, I avoided politics altogether, living in a state of cynical withdrawal as I witnessed American society and culture begin to crumble as the cracks in the foundations fragmented into gaping chasms. I go on to say, for much of my adult life, I sought to be as nonpartisan as possible, realizing that neither political party is ideal, to say the least. But the Democratic Party of the last 50 years, since it's lurched leftward in 1972 with the nomination of George McGovern, is not the Democratic Party of FDR or even JFK, for that matter. The modern Democratic Party is simply the partisan political expression of a secular socialist ideology. Though Republicans are often timid and pathetic, it is the Democratic Party that is the driving force behind virtually all of the immoral, irrational, impractical, irresponsible, and counterproductive policies and programs that are bankrupting America economically, socially, morally, and spiritually. Christians who still identify with the Democratic Party are living in the distant past, totally out of touch with reality, and seemingly incapable of connecting the dots. The Republican Party may be, and oftentimes is, now I wrote this several years ago, by the way, oftentimes is the party of mediocrity. But the Democratic Party is indisputably the party of venality. Mediocrity is a concession to human limitations and human fallibility. Venality is a purposeful surrender to the most base and evil impulses in human nature. In a broken and fallen world, I will take mediocrity over venality any day. It is an unfortunate choice that we often, but thankfully not always, have to make. Politics is mostly about damage control. In other words, electing people into office who will do the least harm and then holding them accountable. Let's see, one more brief citation here. And this is in a chapter called The Culture War in the Two Americas, Politics and the Culture War. I wrote, as I recounted in the previous chapter, for much of my adult life, I strive to be scrupulously nonpartisan. I go on to say that the parties come to represent not only two opposing political ideologies, but in many ways, contrasting worldviews. Ever since the late 1960s, the Democratic Party has been pulled further and further to the left to the point that it advocates a massive cradle-to-grave socialistic welfare state. We'll hear more about that in the article on C.S. Lewis on politics tonight. They also are the party of open borders and sanctuary cities, liberalized drug laws, the LGBTQ agenda, abortion on demand, increased government control of the economy, education, and healthcare. And I went on from there, but what a reminder of the disgrace we saw last night, the State of the Union address. So politics is actually one manifestation of the great spiritual warfare and the great culture war that most of us have grown up with a cognizance of for many, many years. And again, the spectacle we saw last night just brought all of this back to mind. Right? So, we have a very imperfect president with a very imperfect agenda, but let's pray earnestly that he will submit to common sense and reality, and that he'll be used by God to accomplish the most good possible in, again, this very, very flawed and contentious political environment. These things matter a great deal. So if we take comprehensive Christian discipleship seriously, we have to include our political responsibilities as well. And I know virtually all of you understand that very, very well. So with that, I do want to go ahead and start the process here tonight. The 4 articles will be that'll be presented, and so we're going to start with Bruce and his article, C.S. Lewis, Jack the Giant Killer. That, of course, is in the appendix of the C.S. Lewis study guide that most everyone, I think, has a copy of. So Bruce, very much looking forward to it. Thank you.
How did you sufficiently shoot out my audience? Golly. Who'd get you to open for them? This matters, yeah. Just briefly, because not all of you know me particularly well. I grew up a Christian, but a very lukewarm sort of Christian, but accepted Christ and then walked away, as so many people do, especially young men in their teens and so forth. Met and married the gorgeous Pamela, who had never had a Christian background. We lived overseas. We had 2 children in Malaysia. We had 2 children in England. We finally moved back here to Atlanta, but by that time we were both seeking, but from different perspectives. I'd been there, done that. She'd never been there. And somehow, by the grace of God, at the age I was then in my 40s, I came to belief in Christ. Pamela did as well, baptized. We have 4 daughters who are baptized believers and raised in Christian families, and it's been an absolutely wonderful thing. Not long after I really got involved in the church, I discovered Christian apologetics. So I sought Jeffrey out. We met at an apologetics conference here at Johnson Ferry, actually. And he very kindly, sort of invited us to dinner and kind of interviewed me and asked me if I'd like to join his board. And it's so long ago now, I don't remember how long I've been on your board, but it's probably it's got to be 20 years, hasn't it? Several days, yeah. Yeah, right there. Anyway, so that's sort of the background. Let me just get started because time is of the essence. For those of you online, I did write some, I didn't do PowerPoint. I have some notes on the whiteboard here, which you obviously can't see. They're very skeletal. I think it'll be clear from the, I don't think you'll miss anything. It just was a way for people to sort of keep track of some of the things that we're talking about. So C.S. Lewis, Jack the Giant Killer. Our essay says that M.D. Ashleyman, a professor, I love people with, multiple vowels in their names. That's Ashleyman, it's wonderful. Professor of Emeritus of Education at Boston University, but that hardly scratches the surface. Reading Ashleyman comes in sort of 3 stages. The first will quickly give you the sinking feeling that you haven't really read much at all. The second stage is when you realize that those things that you have read, you probably didn't understand completely or correctly. And the third stage is with all the references to things you never heard of, causing much looking up of books and words and historical figures and the like, but it builds character. So for Ashleyman to take to praising Lewis is certainly a feather in Jack's cap. The article starts from a rather surprising coincidence of 3 people who all died on the same day, November 22nd, 1963. For some reason, he failed to notice that was my 17th birthday. That was John F. Kennedy, Aldous Huxley, and C.S. Lewis. And while the first 2 were lionized during their lifetimes, both would have seen their lusters tarnished significantly as history took a longer look at them after their deaths. But that was not true of Lewis. Though at the time of his death, he was seen as almost a throwback to an earlier age, as his reputation and our appreciation of his life work have only grown over the time, witnessed by the sale of millions of his books worldwide in multiple languages. So just how did he gain that recognition and reputation? His early life was not easy. His experiences in World War I, as we've seen, were devastating, not just to himself, but things that he saw going on around him. He had a troubled relationship with religion, passing from Christianity to agnosticism, atheism, and even dabbling in the occult. But as an adult with Christianity, he eventually met his match and came to see it as truth. But it was still a struggle. After all that, to go against the grain of his time to promote a religion of which public opinion was in definite decline certainly didn't endear him to anyone. So just what was the giant of Ashleyman's description of Lewis, the giant killer? It was nothing less than philosophical subjectivism. I can tell you were hoping for something that wouldn't require so much heavy lifting. So let's see if I can lighten the load, as if I've ever lightened anybody's load. And since Lewis spent his life among words, I might start with something grammatical. I think it was important for us to define our terms. We all know the word subject. In English grammar, it's the lead in a sentence. If there is doing to be done, it's the subject who's doing the doing, as it were. It often contributes the point of view from which the sentence has been constructed, as in something like, I saw the thief running down the street. And then there's the word object. In an English sentence, it tells us what has received the action of the doer, as in the ball. I hit the ball. Got it. And then there's the word object. I hit the ball. Now, languages signal these components, which is very important. It's very important to tell the subject from the object in 2 basically different ways around the world. This is just because this amuses me. The first is called analytic languages, where they depend on word order to tell you what the subject is and what the object is. Major analytical languages are English and Chinese. And the second category is called synthetic. And these modify the form of the word to make it clear what part of speech and what function it has within the sentence. So that if the boy is the subject, it has one ending, and if the boy is the object, it has a different ending. Examples of such languages include Greek, Latin, and some Romance languages, all famous for having lots of grammar, or way too much grammar, if you remember back. But with subject versus object, we're dealing with what we might call a neutral difference or distinction. Subject and object are seldom matters of opinion, right? But let's take these simple words to a different level, to subjectivity and objectivity. These are not names of something, but names of perspectives. To have a subjective perspective is to have a personal point of view. Subjectivity is the quality of being influenced by personal feelings, tastes, and opinions. For example, memories typically exhibit a high degree of subjectivity, which is why in a court of law, memories are always sort of suspect because they change with the time, as we all know. And like a subjective perspective, there is an objective one. Objective typically means based on facts or more broadly reality, although one's overall perspective can simultaneously incorporate some of each. If you talk about a topic, you may talk subjectively at one point and objectively on another. And these are really just our perspectives, which are important. Our final definition is subjectivism and objectivism. Our old friend ism is technically used to identify an ideology or a movement. This is not in itself a bad thing. Think of words like theism and romanticism and abolitionism and the like. But the problems begin when these positions grant their founding idea a life of its own. I always like the saying, he jumped on his horse and rode off in all directions. Right? When this runaway stage is reached, the underlying idea becomes central to the way the world is understood. For example, a Marxist views everything from the perspective of oppressor and oppressed. Abraham Maslow famously noted that if the only tool you have is a hammer, you'll treat everything like a nail. And so can be the same thing with isms. When your personal insight, preferences, and opinions dictate what you take the world to be, you are simply not on a good path. Just to be balanced, let's note that the other side of this twosome, objectivity, is also open to the same overreach. Objectivity is useful and necessary. It's a useful and necessary part of our mental resources. But objectivism is can be a form of dysfunction, where anything subjective is dismissed as unimportant or even non-existent. Odd as it may seem, there are so-called objective materialist philosophies teaching in our universities today who reject the reality of immaterial concepts, simple things like free will and consciousness. Hard to imagine how you but if I can't find it with my Geiger counter, it must not exist, kind of thing, right? Now, with that behind us, let's return to Ashleyman's praise of Lewis as someone who stood against philosophical subjectivism. Hopefully that phrase takes on new meaning for you now. We take philosophy to simply mean here the study of reality, and subjectivism here means allowing your philosophy to be overly influenced by personal points of view that dictate your understanding of reality, and worse yet, cause you to reject the idea that truth need come from other sources. In the first half of the 20th century, subjectivism was in the air. It had its roots in the philosophy of the earlier century. For example, those of you who, well, I guess there's somebody who was a couple of you in the Christian history class. We've been talking about Immanuel Kant, and he famously said that we could really never know reality. All we could know was our own impression of reality. And that was very much, although he didn't mean it in the way it's turned out, very much of a subjective turn, right? It was all the rage. And these sorts of ideas bore a lot of fruit, bad fruit, one might say. Things began to focus more and more on feelings and less on reason. If you need an example, think of Freud, who traced everything to our psychological makeup. What source could be more intimate or personal or more subjective than looking inside yourself to find the truth, right? What you really are like. So here we find Lewis, trained into philosophy along with ancient literature, now adopting a religion which made objective claims as to the life and person of Jesus Christ. While there's little doubt that Christ can and does impact subjective areas of believers' lives, that process still has its roots in a public and objective fact. Again, the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so Lewis set out to speak against the zeitgeist, which is just a fancy German word for the spirit of the times. His point raised time and again, both in his formal writing and his fiction. It's really interesting. He did it in both, right? Think of Aslan and everything in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Was that objective truth did exist and that our rational faculties were competent to discern it. Right? But you had to argue for that in this subjective world that he was in England in the early part of the last century. That was not a popular message, but he was in good company, this perspective having roots as far back as Plato and Aristotle. Lewis claimed that we were living in, I love this term, a world of incessant autobiography, in that everyone seemed to think that their lived experience was all they needed to understand the world, causing him to remark that he who marries the spirit of the age is soon a widower. Or I like to say, be careful which bandwagon you jump on. Let's talk maybe a little clearer as to the dangers of subjectivism. Lewis never wrote against subjectivity, but against subjectivism. When subjectivity morphs into subjectivism, projecting onto reality whatever it wants, when it feels no obligation to reality, when it justifies whatever it chooses, we have a problem. And then I like this way of putting it. It seeks to adjust reality to itself rather than itself to reality. No guidelines, no point of reference. Lewis famously said, how would I have known a crooked line if I didn't know what a straight line was? You know, you need to have some point of reference, right? Lewis firmly believed that subjectivism was likely to lead to the justification of evil. After all, we start looking inside. Pamela and I like to say, man is not the rational animal, man is the rationalizing animal, right? We can rationalize just about anything. After all, if you have no external limits, where are you going to find them inside yourself where you can easily justify anything? And this possibility did not only apply to the non-Christian, Christians can just as well fall into this trap. And Lewis noted that of all bad men, the worst of bad men were religious ones. I've always objected to burning heretics at the store, supposed heretics at the stake, and inquisitions and things of that nature. But anyway, perhaps his most pointed book in this regard is The Abolition of Man, written in 1943, followed later that year with an essay, The Poison of Subjectivism. So what were his arguments there? And they're listed down there at the bottom. Subjectivism undermines the very concept of value. Because if there is no real basis for preferring one value over another, we will soon arrive at moral relativism where any action can be justified on individual preferences. Lewis argued that this ultimately destroys the possibility of meaningful moral discourse or even action. Subjectivism contradicts our common experience that we do have strong moral intuitions that some actions are objectively right or wrong regardless of our feelings. Right? Subjectivism cannot account for these deeply held moral convictions. For example, that it's wrong to torture babies for fun. Subjectivism leads to the abolition of man. Denying objective values compromises our ability to make meaningful choices and act fully as human beings. We become creatures of impulse and desire, driven by feelings rather than principles. This leads only to the dehumanization of society, which I hope you feel would be a bad outcome. Subjectivism is self-refuting. Saying that all values are subjective is itself a value judgment. Right? It is not based on any objective truth value. If someone says, objectively speaking, there is no truth, the best answer is that statement true? Right? I've never heard anyone start a sentence with subjectively speaking. Perhaps, perhaps because subjectivism is not typically associated with truth, right? Which is, after all, what C.S. Lewis was after above all else. And finally, a more complex one, subjectivism ignores the existence of natural law. It's a much more complex argument here because you would first need to justify the existence of natural law, which is, after all, accessible, supposedly, to all people through reason and intuition. I believe it is. But subjectivism denies natural law and thereby ignores a fundamental aspect of human morality. We know that it is wrong to lie, cheat, and steal. These restrictions are simply not a matter of opinion. And all you have to do is watch a young child deny when everyone in the room knows that he or she did what they're denying. That's just no one has to teach them that. It's somehow that's an innate thing that we do. So let's bring this to a close. Ashleyman's essay closes quoting a highly respected Oxford academic, A.D. Nuttall, again, someone I'd never heard of, who wrote an influential assessment of Lewis in 1984, and the great sociologist Peter Berger. You can locate these on page 44 of your study guide, bottom half of the right-hand column. First, Nuttall. Ashman says, not only attributed the hostility of the intelligentsia to Lewis to the principal factor of mere opposition to the zeitgeist. At present, Nuttall said, people do not want to be told that value is objective. Just don't want to do it. I recall some. I think Jeffrey with the divided house, they don't want to hear it, right? Ashman goes on to represent Nuttall, saying the objectivity of value restricts the absoluteness of the self. If you think you're everything and your autobiography is all you need to understand the world, right? You need a little come down a couple of pegs, and natural law will help to do that, to put it at the service of what would I say, the absolute, to restrict the absoluteness of the self, to subordinate it to the good and the true. We're back to Plato and Aristotle here, and vindicate the fundamental sanity and soundness of the whole rational moral tradition of right reason, right? Which said that you could reason your way to these things, which has been with us since Socrates. In fact, it vindicates the very idea and possibility of civilization. Ashman follows with a quote from sociologist Peter Berger. Relativism has massively invaded daily life in the West, partly because students are educated by teachers who promote wittingly or unwittingly relativistic ideas. Lewis's Abolition of Man is precisely a book for teachers and parents and citizens because it reiterates in a fresh, lucid, modern idiom the central arguments against relativism and subjectivism that have always formed the spine of Western civilization, which I think many of us feel is in a perilous state at the moment. And then Lewis's own writing in scholarly, apologetic, and fictional modes is a standing reproach to the literary culture of histrionic, incessantly autobiographical posturing. I love it, right? Let me tell you my story. As I like to say, strong letter to follow. Finally, Nuttall again saying that Lewis was able to engage, if necessary, in fundamental philosophy, as he was a trained philosopher. But the philosophy he gave us was remote from fashion. That's a good thing, remote from fashion. Fashion, after all, was subjectivism, and yet close to the conceptual practice of the ordinary person, so they could understand it. Not many people can do that. I don't know about you, but I'd kind of like that on my tombstone. Thank you.
Let's not let Bruce off so easily. Any comments, questions in particular? Those of you joining us online and those in the room here? Anything that could use some further clarification? This is really quite a brilliant article. It provides a lot of key insight or good insight into what I would say is probably a key element in his philosophy. And so one line that really struck me in this article, if you've read the article, is on page 44, about halfway down the left-hand column. Very simple little sentence that says, Lewis was unafraid of the zeitgeist. He was unafraid of the zeitgeist. And in fact, he had absolutely no interest in popular culture and popular ideas that were circulating. He understood that to really access the depths of reality and truth, we go back into history and trace these ideas, as they've developed over many, many centuries, rather than just latching on to whatever is popular. So this idea of philosophical subjectivism and philosophical relativism that you emphasized, I mean, that really is our fundamental philosophical fallacy, isn't it? That's where everything erroneous derives from, is philosophical subjectivism, Any other thoughts on any of that? And then we'll move right on.
No, just recall, I mentioned here, Lewis had said, he who marries the zeitgeist will soon be a widower.
Mhm.
See it? And I look, back to what Jeffrey was saying about what we saw last night on television. People there, and there are a lot of them there who are just following the spirit of the time. I don't know who got to say that, who got to
And-
write that in stone. they're following that.
Yeah, and it goes right back to subjectivity becoming subjectivism.
Right,
And
right.
it becomes the ideology.
Because their view is coloring the world. Why else would a political party, which is hopefully to come in from the wilderness, pick an 80-20 issue where 80% of the people take the opposite side from them and just decide they're gonna rebuild their fortunes with that? And it's just, it's kind of crazy, but frankly, I wish it to them.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Very, very well done. Thanks, Bruce. All right, next up is Allegra, and her article is C.S. Lewis for the Ages. And Allegra, I understand you're going to incorporate a PowerPoint presentation in this.
Yes.
So
Before I start, though, I want to just say, subjectively speaking, thank you very much.
that's just your opinion.
It's just my opinion, but I did want to start my sentence with subjectively speaking. So let me see if I can figure out how to share this with everybody. I'm going to open it here. That's probably not how I do it for Zoom though, so hang on. And I'll also just say that, has that got it? I think so.
Yes.
And then
We got it.
all right, well, y'all get to see this view because my menu options are hidden up there. So we'll just go with it like that. And I'm just gonna say my teenage son is here tonight, so that's why I pulled out all the stops. And with the PowerPoint, just, wanted to make sure that,
If you hit that down there,
oh,
you should
that
get
will,
rid of all this rest of the stuff. There you go.
okay. Thank you very much. All right, so he got the hard one. I get the easy one. Just talking about all the wonderful writings of C.S. Lewis. So this is based on an article called C.S. Lewis for the Ages. And it is an article that was in a book that was published. Now, see, Bruce, I don't know how to advance now that you've done that for me. Oh, there we go. Okay, so here we go. So the article that he has in our study guide is pulled from a book that was written by 24 men and women collectively talking about what they knew about C.S. Lewis. So they were talking about their remembrances of him and things that they wanted to share and remember of his life. So that's kind of a cool approach for a biography, not an autobiography, right? But 24 men and women writing stories and anecdotes and information about the impact that C.S. Lewis had on their life. So as we just heard over from Bruce's presentation, his legacy has just grown since his death. So that article, Peter Kraft article, was written in what, 2006, something like that. I don't know. Anyway, here we are, 2025, and he has become, he is no longer a zeitgeist, if I'm using the word correctly, because it's been a good long period of time. But one of the things that, can y'all see that? I don't know. This is unfortunate here. Oh, there we go.
More on the right top.
Okay.
Click those three.
Hide.
Go to meeting info.
Okay. Now, okay, well, it is what it is. It's fine. So anyway, this just kind of highlights the continued popularity of C.S. Lewis. He wrote over 40 books. Many of those books are compilations of multiple essays that he has written over the years. To Jeffrey's point earlier, a lot of these are on politics. He wrote on just a wide variety of subjects in his essays. Weight of Glory is one that we've talked about the past couple of weeks, which is one of my all-time favorite essays. But as I was just looking into this, there are just essays on topic after topic after topic. And so basically, if you have anything that you have a question about, you can probably find some commentary or analysis that he has done over that. And as
Bruce also mentioned, he just spans multiple genres. So he has apologetics writing, he has fantasy writings, he wrote for children, he wrote for adults. And so I don't know about you guys, but The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is one that I read as a child. It's one that I read to my children. And yet again, I read it just a couple of years back with a book club, and we found all sorts of new things that we hadn't even noticed as a child. And it was just great to sit and talk about, you know, all the different symbolisms, all the different Christian theology that can be found in those books that were written for children, but are still applicable today, even as an adult. I have not read the science trilogy. I have it on my to-do list, but it is just they're like this big, and so I haven't quite gotten into them, but I do understand that those are also very popular. I also understand that the book Abolition of Man, that is another one of his super fantastic books, is taken into is one of the basis for what he documented in the space trilogy. So it just gives you another perspective of the exact same concepts that he's going through in the Abolition of Man, when he's talking about how we're just losing our humanity and we're growing men without chests, is the way that he ends that sad analysis that is just so very true today, where we're expecting people to behave in a certain way, but we're not teaching them why. We're not giving them any fundamentals. So there's nothing going on in their head and to give them any basis for what they are needing to understand and believe. So let me see. And this is where, there we go. Okay. So this was one of the interesting parts on the article that our author was talking about, that a few years after his death, some people put a very brief little article in the new National Review, actually, and just said, hey, anybody interested in getting together and talking about C.S. Lewis? Well, that has just been unbelievably a popular idea. That organization that began in New York is still continuing today. It's one of the longest living or longest existing organizations where people get together and talk about C.S. Lewis. If you go onto their website now, you can actually subscribe and get an actual mailed copy of the bulletin that has different articles that they publish, and it is very interesting. You can also read it online. They have a Facebook page. So this is still a very active group. But also, if you get Millie's newsletter, you'll know that there's a C.S. Lewis Society here in Atlanta, and they do a lot of different things as well. And they have a program that you can go through and just read about and go through that program as well, and just to get more information about him. But also, if you just do a search online, there are these organizations all across the world. And it is really quite astounding when you look at kind of the list of what's available. You could be in Australia, you could be here, you could be in Alaska, well, I don't know about China and Russia, but anyway, they might have them too. They just don't post them on Google. So anyway, the question in this part of the article is, what would C.S. Lewis say? You can't read it, but it's in the article if you're looking there. And so the Mr. McGovern, who writes this article, he says that I am sure that he would have tried to dissuade us from getting together to talk about him, right? He would have wanted us to look at scripture. He would have wanted us to look at Dante, Augustine, all these classic authors that he grew up studying. No, don't get together and talk about me. This is who you need to study. But then later in the essay, there's also a comment that says, and I find this to be true for myself as well, that most admirers of C.S. Lewis have found that their reading and their interests are widened, they're deepened, they're expanded, rather than being narrowed and confined. So rather than being concerned that all we're going to do when we get together and meet is talk about Lewis, no, what we're going to do is we're going to get together and we're going to talk about Lewis, but then that's going to make us want to go and read something that influenced his writing. And so it's going to actually wind up broadening our horizons rather than narrowing them. So I thought that was an interesting perspective that he put later in the comments there. And then he also comments that there's a sense of community. So like when people get together in these C.S. Lewis organizations, they feel a sense of community that sometimes in our lives as Christians, out in the world, in the secular world, we don't necessarily have that feeling of community. And so by having a common interest, there's a basis for friendship right there. And that's also a topic that Lewis talks about in his book on the four loves and how you start establishing relationships. And I also would like to say, you know, Jeffrey, we kind of probably find that here, right? I was very blessed to meet you guys early in our time here in East Cobb over at another church in the near vicinity. I also was able to meet Millie there. I've established, you know, friendships with both of you guys over the years. I've met Bruce. And Donna and her husband aren't here. Donna's the other reason I did the PowerPoint, right? Because, you know, she always does the amazing ones. So this isn't no visuals and vocals. But anyway, so that's another thing, you know, we get together with groups of people like-minded, and it's much more easier to start a basis for a relationship when you have some commonalities. So that was something that they commented on here. And then, I mean, I had to pull Aslan. This isn't the real Aslan, but I had to pull him in, right? Because he's just so important in the Lewis, in our memories of Lewis. Anyway, one of the comments that really struck me when in the section about there's something about Lewis. Lewis convinces his readers that he is the most reliable guide that they have found on any subject that matters most. So, right, if we're talking about the existence of God, if we're talking about politics or whatever the topic is, we find that he's a reliable guide. I know last week, Jeffrey commented that one of the things C.S. Lewis said about himself was that he wanted to make things relatable. And I don't know about you guys, but I do find that even with something like Mere Christianity, I actually have to read it 2 or 3 times before I, you know, understand it. So one paragraph might take me a couple of hours. But he is still a fantastic guide to kind of give you something to think about. And then he goes on to say that we find that he's encountered our difficulties, he's dealt with them, he has anticipated our objections, and then unfortunately, he has probably articulated it better than we could even do ourselves, right? You know, so I find that to be very true for myself as well. And then he commented that it is not too much to say that he convinces his readers that however far they go in whatever the topic is that they're looking at, that they're reading about, or whatever, that he's not only been there, but he's already on his way back, right? So he knows all that, and he's coming back to meet you and maybe hold your hand to walk you back to the end or something like that. But anyway, the point being is just that he's got a great way of understanding the topic and then communicating that topic. So anyway, then it says that our need for such a guide will not diminish in the years ahead. So that is just something to think about, you know, as you're looking about into Lewis. I found that I didn't know anything about his life. I had watched that movie, A Reluctant Convert. It doesn't really go into the level of detail that we go here. And really, when you know so much about his background, it really gives you a lot of perspective on how he came to understand these truths, how he lived these truths out. And that really does make him to be another person that gives him a little bit more credibility that you can believe what he's doing. Anyway, it says also in this article that one of the things that for us as a takeaway that we can use Lewis's help in judging, one, what changes are to be welcomed and defended, what changes are to be resisted and attacked, and which are to be ignored but can be obtained from his books, right? So anyway, the point being is that Lewis, once he came to Christianity, his center remained unchanged on the subjects that mattered most. He really believed what he wrote about, and he practiced what he preached. So anyway, that was what the article is about. I hope that you all have read a number of his books or his essays. There, again, are just a very large number of them, and we can only skim the surface, even in our discussion over the course of this semester of them, but I do highly recommend that you read Abolition of Man if you haven't. The allegory, Till We Have Faces, was another one that will probably just blow your mind. The Four Loves is a great one. And then obviously there's the classic Mere Christianity that everybody needs to read, but there's just plenty more. So I just want to encourage you as I finish here that to the extent you haven't picked up some of his books, that it would be worth your time, worth your effort, but do plan to read them more than once. And I think that was also something that they commented on in the books, that they find that they read the books and then they reread the books, and then sometimes you reread and reread the books. So anyway, just wanted to throw that out there. And thank you for allowing me to have the easiest probably of all the articles to talk about, and the most fun, just getting to reminisce on the legacy that he has left behind through his writings. So let me see if I can figure out how to, okay, I think I returned this back, and there you go. So, thank you guys. Okay. He didn't throw anything at me. That's the good part. He's home on spring break, so as the kids come home, they rotate through. So y'all will see. Probably my other son will be here next week. So there you go.
Well, and that's not a concession to great inflation. You earned it.
Thank
You
you.
earned it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Allegra, hey, no, Allegra, it's Donna. I just wanted to say your PowerPoint was
Oh, you're
beautiful.
hiding over there.
Yeah, of
I
course.
see how it is. Well, good.
No, but your PowerPoint was beautiful and also your talk. So thank you very much. We enjoyed it.
Well, good.
Other comments,
And
questions?
Donna knows, and Millie knows, I am a prolific reader. I love reading. So this was the perfect topic for me to talk about. Reading books and apologetic books are my favorite. Yes, Bruce.
I have a simple question. Has anybody in here read the Space Trilogy?
I've read the last of the three. Yeah.
Well, good, we should
That-
get together,
that's
'cause I've read
hideous.
the
You
first two.
started at
That's
the
it
end.
is.
You started at the end.
Well, it's the most explicitly political.
Oh,
That hideous strength is brilliant.
The turnout was very much a fantasy story. And I read it as a non-Christian, so I wasn't aware of all of it. I loved it, it was wonderful. The second one was much more dark and beginning to sort of flesh out some of these ideas. And but it was like, it was heavy lifting in my time. And I never read the third, so I probably do that. But I probably need to get a running start and go back.
yes. Yes, I need to as well.
Other comments, questions? Now, you said this was the easiest article. It was the longest article.
Oh,
You
I
did
it was.
you did a very good job
Oh.
condensing it down to the specifics. A couple of things real quickly. Behind the section, why are we attracted to C.S. Lewis as a great exemplar of Christian thinking? The author makes 3 points. First of all, he was a very fine writer, interesting writer who would occasionally incorporate humor into his writings. Secondly, he says, a second source of Lewis's appeal is the simple reassurance that his readers obtain from knowing that a distinguished career in secular learning
That's true.
was comfortably combined with steadfast belief in Orthodox Christianity. So here's someone who really is, your typical polymath who has a wide range of knowledge in a lot of fields, history, philosophy, and so on. And then thirdly, Lewis's ability to dissect various enthusiasms and follies of the 20th century. Now, there's an interesting word in this article, which also shows up in Bruce's.
I didn't look it up.
What's that?
I said I didn't look that word up. I
You know,
circled it, but I didn't get back to it.
You know what I'm talking about? Okay, also, it's a word that appeared in Bruce's article as well. And it refers to Lewis in the context of neophilia. Neophilia. Okay, so what's that supposed to mean? absolutely. Love of,
I teach that in my class.
oh, do you?
Learn suffixes and put it together and figure out.
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to that idea that he's not impressed necessarily by new ideas and all. They need to be, they need to be time tested.
Jeff, can you stand in front of the camera?
There you go.
Hello.
Maybe.
That's why he wanted us to go back to scriptures and Augustine and all of those instead of reading himself, right, in the theoretical article.
Yeah, yeah. Bruce?
Neophilia, I took that out of the book I read because of nominalism and neophilia. Nominalism is another one of those philosophies that basically is the opposite of realism. And so it really sort of means that things aren't things until we give them a name, and that's up to us. It's random how we sort of do that.
Mhm.
And it's just, it's not a good place to go.
Mhm.
Today we find ourselves taking words like tolerance and gender and turning them into something they never were meant to be.
Were meant to be, yeah. Yeah.
That's not a good.
Yeah.
The hijacking
Yeah.
of language.
And both Lewis and Tolkien had very, very little interest in, again, pop culture, modern culture and all, whether it was movies or books or music or whatever. And just one more thing, and I cited this in my book, American Crisis, talking about our need to be well-informed and involved in politics. And he makes this brilliant comment: a sick society needs to think much about politics, just as a sick man must think a lot about his digestion. Never thought about it exactly that way. To ignore the subject, politics, may be fatal cowardice for the one as for the other. But if either comes to regard it as the natural food of the mind, then he says, what was undertaken for the sake of health has become itself a new and deadly disease. So we shouldn't be obsessed with politics and so on, but the more perverse it becomes, and we've certainly seen that in our lifetimes, the more we have to take it seriously and be involved. I think we all would prefer just to leave it and go on to other things, but it's an integral part of Christian discipleship. Yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you again. Anything
Okay.
else you'd like to mention?
No, not necessarily, but as we transition to the talk on politics and in connection with your opening of the class, I did want to just comment that one of the, and she's one of the popular podcasters right now for the young girls, but Allie Beth Stuckey always says that politics matter because policies matter, and policies affect people and people matter, right? So that's another reason it's easy to not want to be involved in politics, but if you follow the logical chain of it, it affects how we live our lives, it affects how our neighbors live their lives, and that's why it matters.
I mean, it
So
would be
anyway.
irresponsible not to. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank
So,
you very much.
you.
Excellent. All right. So, next up is Ally, and her topic does have political ramifications, to say the least. C.S. Lewis, is progress possible? Willing slaves of the welfare state. He was very anti-socialist, as I'm sure you'll talk about. So thank you, Ally. Looking forward to it.
I think it's interesting that how much what Bruce said about subjectivism versus being objective, just what defines truth fits in nicely with what C.S. Lewis talks about in this article. Okay, as you know, C.S. Lewis wrote an article titled, "Is Progress Possible?" The subtitle, "Willing Slaves of the Welfare State." Now, he wrote this in 1958, so keep that in mind as it rings so true with today. I think throughout this article, you're going to see that when he talks about progress, the end is inevitably the welfare state, and you'll see why that is. Now, if I were to go out on the street in front of Johnson Ferry and meet the average person and ask them, do you want progress? Well, everybody would say, well, yes, of course, progress. I mean, it has a wonderful ring to it. But the issue is, of course, how does somebody define the word progress? That's everything, right? For example, this is so obvious, but in the last 4 years, I know people that said, oh, we made such great progress because of their ideologies, right? We made such great progress. Whereas I felt like my world was turning inside out and upside down. And so was it progressed? Not to me. So it's so important to define words. And we talked about how words get hijacked, and that's going on all the time. We have to fight against losing the value of words. That was good. Okay. All right. So when it comes to the government legislating progress, progress has to be defined. Lewis defines progress as increasing goodness and happiness of individual lives, rather than a lot of times when we hear progress, we think making life better, easier, and longer, like a longer life expectancy, as if that were the only goal, if that were progress. I mean, what kind of life do people, that's a side question. You can have a long life, but are you really having a quality life? So he asked this question, are we becoming better? Are we becoming happier? And he says that the trajectory of this progress depends upon two basic things. First, science, and second, the relationship between the government and its subjects. So first, there is a danger. The danger of the advancements and increased application of science is that, of course, science can be used for good. We all would agree, but it also can be used for evil. I think we saw a good example of this during the whole COVID thing. I mean, where people's jobs were threatened, and you were made to, I never got the vax, and I don't judge anyone who did, but I didn't want to. And boy, did I catch it from some of my siblings for that, and was told basically that I was as just dangerous, selfish, and as irrational as a flat earther. At the end of the day, scientific advancements are only good to the degree that a good person is making good decisions regarding good science, right? And that's a whole bunch of subjectivity. See how it's connected? They all come together, right? As a foundation has eroded. Okay, the second point is the relationship between the government and its citizens. Somewhere along the way, the Western world has lost an accurate view of crime. So we would probably say crime is an offensive act deserving of retributive punishment, punishment that suits the crime. Now, slowly though, we have come to see criminals as victims in need of a cure. So when you equate crime and disease as the same thing that can be cured, there's a problem. And Lewis argues that that is exactly how Hitler was able to convince good Germans to ship their fellow countrymen, the Jews, off in cattle trains. Hitler carefully presented the Jews as a disease in society, and that they could and must be cured. When people can be fixed or cured, rather than be held accountable for wrongs done, who is to say that our Christianity is not at risk? The experts may accuse us of thought crimes simply because we believe in Scripture. Lewis explains how this shift has taken place. The 2 world wars caused upheaval and fear and an undermining of people's security. So the government took away freedoms bit by bit, and we have insidiously and increasingly become wards of the state. Interestingly, as we've said earlier, Lewis points out how the language reflects this change. Those governing us were once called rulers, but now they are called leaders. Subtle but effective change. He says, we are less their subjects and therefore under the rule of law, and more their wards, pupils, or even Lewis calls domestic animals. Now remember, Lewis wrote this 67 years ago. Think of the many generations that have transpired since then, being raised in this thinking and in this language. And then here's the big problem. If all you know from birth is the government supplying you breakfast at school, lunch at school, your food stamp dinner, and your subsidized housing, are we not then like a tamed animal who would starve if let out of our cages? That's, he further argues that who can ever criticize this government when the state is everyone's schoolmaster and employer? And doesn't that hit home as we reflect on what our public schools have turned out for decades? Illiterate, woke, anti-American socialists who believe that the highest truth is their feelings. Those who think the government is the answer or the savior of man's modern ills completely disregard, or at the very least, underestimate man's total depravity. Whoever is in power, whoever is an expert, calls the shots. And that person is a mere mortal, capable of all kinds of mistakes, as well as overt and complete evil. The experts will base their control of the masses on their claim to knowledge. As Lewis says, if we are to be mothered, mother must know best. This means they must increasingly rely on the advice of scientists until, in the end, the politicians are merely the scientists' puppets. Again, think COVID, right? Think how it was just, all that information was just coming at us like a mantra. Okay. Now, he also has another warning, which may surprise some of you, but he's very balanced. He says that he warns against any pretense of a government as a theocracy. It simply cannot be, and we must be very careful. He says, quote, I believe in God, but I detest theocracy. For every government consists of mere men and is strictly viewed a makeshift. If it adds to its commands, thus saith the Lord, it lies, and it lies dangerously. Now, I don't know much about Christian nationalism. I hear that term bandied about. I personally haven't experienced it with my Christian friends, but if that, I know I have a sister who is really terrified of that, and I've said there was a theocracy, and it ended when Saul became the king, and we're not doing that. When God, ruled us with the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke, that was a theocracy. It's not now. But that doesn't, we're fully responsible to put our worldview, which is based on scripture, and to vote our conscience that way. We're basing it on that, but we're not a theocracy. Okay, so Lewis presents towards the end a quagmire, and this is it. On the one hand, we have problems in this world. We have hunger and disease in a lot of the world still. And on the other hand, we have a solution, what he calls the omnicompetent global technocracy. And yet the solution to feeding and healing masses of humanity must needs take away individual freedoms. He wonders if it's possible to provide global solutions without enslaving all the inhabitants of the world. Very true. So throughout the article, Lewis ties progress, as people define it, as those in power define it, a progress, I would say, apart from a biblical worldview. He ties it to a loss of personal privacy and independence. And those losses have happened so slowly, many don't even question the changes. So if one generation, little changes are made, and then babies are born, and their normal is with those changes, and then in their generation, more changes are made, and so on and so on. It's very insidious until it is absolutely too late. The bottom line is that progress cannot be trusted because it is in the hands of mere men, and corruption is inevitable. Lewis's article, in my opinion, is nothing less than prophetic.
Now, come on, you're supposed to.
Stay up here.
Yeah, you're subjected to analysis here. Any comments, questions? Did Ally mispronounce any words or anything like that, or?
Really is
anything?
prophetic. Look at it as well going on right today.
Absolutely. Oh, it's an amazing article.
It is because, I was thinking, I can read it now and be like, yikes, but when I think how long ago it was, what were his contemporaries thinking? Because he had to be so much more insightful than they were, they're seeing it like this and he's seeing, whoa. So that must have been, I can't even imagine what they thought of it.
Well, the moment the war is over in Europe, there's an election in Great Britain and they elect a socialist. They kick out Churchill
'Cause
and
they
elect a
want
socialist.
security.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's one issue he has to address and deal with. I'm glad you mentioned the sentence, I believe in God, but I detest theocracy. And anytime Christians get involved in political affairs, the secular left wants to accuse us of being theocrats, Christian theocrats. That's generally not at all correct, but unfortunately there are Christian
sister.
theocrats.
Okay,
you know one.
Well, no, she's not one, but she thinks every one of us is.
Yeah, the new, what's it called? New Apostolic Reformation, NAR, is particularly, and also a lot of people who define themselves as neo-Calvinists, followers of J.R.R. Rushdoony and people like that are basically Christian theocrats as well. So they do exist, but we're all sort of implicated,
Right.
whenever we emphasize Christian responsibility in politics, and also his reference to a world welfare state, which of course, to his credit, Donald Trump is very much opposed to that concept. But a lot of Republicans, including, George W. Bush and others.
Sounds like one world order.
Yes,
What
yes.
is it, what, when you say a world welfare state, what policies are trying to be implemented to show that?
The idea of globalism,
EU.
and the EU would be an example, but basically subjecting national independence and sovereignty, national sovereignty to international organizations. The United Nations, the World Health Organization, and so on. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Well, you did such a good job, you get a pass. Okay, so. All right. And so very much looking forward to Karen's presentation. And this is how C.S. Lewis predicted today's college campus craziness. So Karen, very much looking forward to it.
Okay, so we all know there's a big problem going on in college campuses. Unfortunately, the pursuit of truth is no longer more important than worrying about hurt feelings or offense.
Speak up a little bit, Karen.
But on college, on college campuses today, a cultural shift has occurred where professors, students, and administrators, instead of fostering resilience and open debate, now seek protection from potentially offensive ideas and speech, which is, they say, sometimes referred to as microaggressions, small actions or word choices that seem to have a malicious intent but are thought of as a kind of violence nonetheless. It twists the objective idea of being offensive into a subjective charge on behalf of someone claiming to be offended. They claim to do this in the name of conscience, which warns people not to offend others. They demand speech codes, trigger warnings, and even disciplinary action against those who unintentionally offend. We've all witnessed how this approach has led to censorship, cancel culture, and the suppression of free speech and meaningful discussion in the name of emotional safety. And in this article, this movement is referred to as, let's see, there's two people that refer to this movement as vindictive protectiveness. I don't know, Jonathan Haidt and the Greg Lukianoff. And the author suggests that this cultural shift aligns with Lewis's warning in his book, The Abolition of Man, which describes the destructiveness of human beings, abandoning objective morality in favor of subjective feelings, basing morality on personal emotions and desires, deciding for themselves what is right and wrong. So in C.S. Lewis writes in The Abolition of Man, he begins by criticizing an English school book written for young children. It tells of a well-known story about the poet Samuel Coleridge at a waterfall. Coleridge heard one tourist call the waterfall pretty and another call it sublime, and he sided with the second tourist. He said the view of the waterfall was indeed sublime, meaning majestic and of great spiritual worth. According to the schoolbook's author, though, Coleridge's judgment simply reflected his feelings about the waterfall, because to Coleridge, truth is subjective. Taking the story as a starting point, Lewis goes on to show that if the idea that there is no objective truth becomes dominant, it will lead to an abolition of man, because how is man different from the beasts if he lacks the ability of reason to make judgments about what is beautiful and what is not, and about what is right and what is wrong? This objective truth or moral truth is what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao, the basic principles of natural law, the starting point for all moral reasoning, deliberation, and argument, which I know Jeffrey's talked about. These are not principles we have decided are moral. These are principles we have discovered. In other words, this natural moral law exists outside of our will. It exists whether we like it or not, and it is fixed and unchanging. We are born into both a physical and a moral world that we did not create. The principles of the Tao constitute a kind of natural law, not because everyone knows them without being taught, but because they express fundamental truths. And he says we become able to see them only as our character is well formed by moral education. Our emotions must be trained and habituated so that we learn to love the good and not just what seems good for us. And only as our character is thus shaped do we become men and women who are able to see the truth of moral reason. Moral insight, therefore, is not a matter for reason alone. It requires trained emotions and moral habits of behavior instilled in us even before we reach the age of reason. Lewis warns that modern education wants to produce men without chests, men and women without the grounding to respond properly in accordance to reality, traditional morality. Lewis argues that the head rules the belly with the chest. In other words, that human beings are properly governed by emotions, the belly. Lost my place here. Lewis argues that the head rules the belly with the chest. In other words, that human beings are properly governed by emotions, which is the belly, organized by trained habit, the head or reason, into stable sentiments, the chest. To put it yet another way, reason disciplines appetite only with the aid of trained emotions. I wanted to also I was reading a book called The Death of Learning by John Agresto, and it's really made me finish it. I actually just started it. He's been a professor at many schools. I think he was a probate judge in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Anyway, I heard about this book from the podcast, Julie Hartman, who used to do podcasts with Dennis Prager before he had that terrible fall in November. And some of the books she suggested are really good, so I read it. And so I wanted to share this with you because it has to do with what we're talking about. He says that one of the key moments when multiculturalism and diversity advanced was when the replacement of the Western civilization course at Stanford occurred in 1988. We primarily learn about Western civilization through its history, both secular and religious, through the works of its cultural and political figures, and through its thinkers, artists, and authors. Western civilization is studied and learned through its books, documents, monuments, churches, biographies, buildings, art, and music.
If revisionists wanted to not simply make an immediate change, but a more permanent change, a world historical change, a change in human history, they should go to the heart. The world has been told repeatedly that the humanities are the repository of civilization. So where better for a revisionist to go to reshape our thinking and reform, quote, civilization. Agresto believes that the books on Stanford's original course list gave all students a rich introduction to the development of thought within the Western tradition, offering insight into what was their own. But we must not only understand our own heritage, we must also know the historic alternatives and the significant turning points in our history. Criticism of these various courses rarely seem to stem from any supposed weakness other than their political weaknesses. So no matter that these books were intellectually stimulating, or that almost all of them might have played a crucial role in shaping the direction of Western culture, this was considered irrelevant. It didn't matter that they contained the most radically diverse views that have been presented, for example, Plato versus Marx, the Hebrew Bible versus Freud, or Darwin, Dante, and Pascal versus nearly every aspect of contemporary culture. What mattered was that their perspectives appeared to clash with the political beliefs of today's policymakers and education reformers. The original argument for renovating the Western civilization course, according to him, was that it would be opened up and made more inclusive or enriched, quote, enriched, but this did not happen. Instead, it resulted in the non-integration of other cultures into a common core. It soon became clear that the fight for multiculturalism in curriculum decisions could not stop there. It inherently involved the empowerment and therefore the politics of special interest groups. Instead of treating all students simply as students, the push for greater diversity, quote, diversity, categorized them into distinct identities: gay students, Chicano students, women's studies, each with a vested interest in protecting and promoting their books and their studies. What started as a call for inclusion quickly morphed into the fragmentation and lobbying of separate interests and worldviews. A movement originally aimed at openness and unity instead ended up creating more division. There was no genuine effort to explore another advanced culture or civilization to either complement our understanding of European and American traditions or to compare its knowledge and insights with our own. Agresto suggests that true multiculturalism may have failed to take root in higher education because, if approached honestly, it could reveal many uncomfortable truths. For instance, it might encourage us to view evil in a broader context. Understanding American slavery alongside Islamic slavery, African slavery, and oppression under various other ideologies. On a deeper level, true multiculturalism could encourage students to ask a profound question. Is oppression purely cultural, shaped by society, social structures, and systemic forces? Or is it something inherent to human nature? And if it is intrinsic, what ideas, experiences, or moral teachings, whether from the West or the East, have been powerful enough to change human behavior, making racial and gender oppression widely, though not universally, recognized as unjust and slavery almost universally condemned as evil? And exploring these questions, he said, would provide an education simply or deeply relevant to our own future and that of other nations. And he said this movement, or the diversity and multiculturalism movement, seemed to have two primary goals. First, to validate the history and literature of groups who felt marginalized or oppressed by the European or American experience, particularly Black women, Latinos, and LGBTQ individuals. And second, and perhaps more significantly, it's aimed to diminish the prominence of the West, its history and ideas that influence, while denying it any substantial merit or intrinsic value. And there's also something interesting he said about PhDs, which I'll briefly go over. He said PhDs are built in promotion and retention, often based on on exploring new angles, breaking new ground, and being on the cutting edge. So this is all new to me, so I thought it was interesting. I thought I'd share it. Reinventing the wheel is hardly what propels someone in the line of work. This line of work. I should have brought my glasses up. Unfortunately, students don't know about the wheel. For them, the wheel has to be reinvented every time. They don't yet know what the same old thing is, so they need to see it. Agresto says he knows that the narrowness of research has an adverse effect on our subjects and offerings. doctoral programs are structured in a way that increases the narrowness of academic departments across the board and even down to the secondary level. If what passes for graduate scholarship is whatever is on the cutting edge, then undergraduate departments will more and more prize novelty, originality, and faddishness over solid, wide-ranging, and old-fashioned inquiries. And he said knowledge in some fields grows based on their doctoral programs. And they are why in literature, for example, that cultural studies, deconstruction, reader response, gender analysis, prison literature, never heard of that, and so on, take the place of solid, sympathetic, careful reading of great literature. But he did say, he wrote this book in 2022, that some colleges around the nation are pushing back, that the University of Chicago sent a letter to incoming students to the class of 2020, writing in part that our commitment to academic freedom means that we do not support so-called trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own. And he said this was simply a reiteration of the report written by the Committee on the Freedom of Expression from January 2015 that said, education should not be intended to make people comfortable. It is meant to make them think. Universities should be expected to provide the conditions within which hard thought and therefore strong disagreement, independent judgment, and the questioning of stubborn assumptions can flourish in an environment of the greatest freedom. Absolutely. And then just really quick, I wanted to, and of course, this is another article I saw, I was looking online, this is a Newsweek. And just to synopsize it, basically says that not obviously only are the professors and students liberal, the administrators are liberal. He says they're very, very liberal. And he says the way the reason why is because they go to more than half graduate with this education degree, and which is really sad, because they focus on a narrow progressive view of demographics and blah, blah, blah. I know we're running out of time. So, but then I just wanted, this was interesting. This was another article and they were talking about students fighting back. So here are two students, what happened. One was from Friends University, I think that's in Indiana. This is him speaking. I've had professors mark down my grade for disagreeing with them politically. For example, in a sociology class, I expressed disagreement with the professor on the gender wage gap in a paper and provided my sources. When my paper was returned, I saw "do not agree," wrong, written in red pen. Although I consistently got A's in the class, I received a B in this paper, on this paper. I was upset, but I realized arguing with the professor wouldn't get me anything but consistent grade markdowns. And then this person from the University of British Columbia said, in an art class my freshman year, we were told to make a politically provocative sign. So my sign featured Justin Trudeau putting his hand over Jordan Peterson's mouth with the heading, "Free speech is un-Canadian." My TA promptly interrupted my presentation to tell the class about how I was platforming bigotry and transphobia. And I failed the assignment. Isn't that ridiculous? That's crazy. Anyway, that's it. And then one little side note. So between jobs, I've been substitute teaching. And I subbed at middle schools all last week, and I call it the week of hell. Like, seriously. Oh my gosh. It's unbelievable how disrespectful kids are and how they cannot even focus for 40 minutes. Like one teacher even told me, you must walk around and monitor them or else they will not do their work. So anyway, there's so many stories to tell, but I was talking to one of the teachers who I subbed for, and she came back into the class. I don't know how we got on the subject, but she said last year there was a sign, something to do with LGBTQ, and I don't know, teaching people how to be LGBTQ, or it was probably one of those that said, if you feel this way, or you're okay, and da, da, da. And so she said, another teacher said, well, I don't know exactly how she said it, but if you put up this sign, then I want you to put up this sign. And it had to do with Christian, something, I don't know, she didn't know, she just said something to do with Christianity. And she said they told her, no, I'm not going to do that. And you can leave and we won't charge you $1,000. And I said, what do you mean without charging you? She said, well, if a teacher leaves in the middle of the school year, they're charged $1,000, at least at the school. And of course she didn't leave because she needed a job. which was kind of strange. They would say, well, if they thought they were so right, why would they even say that? I don't know. But that's just a side note, like that's going on in the North Fulton School,
Wow.
middle school. And it's supposedly pretty nice area. I'll tell you later, I won't do it on the recording. But I was lulled into a false sense of euphoria because the week before I'd subbed in a middle school. It was the best class I've ever subbed in 13 years.
Oh.
They were 8th grade advanced. They came in, they did the work, and they left. And so that proves they can do it. They're
Right.
capable of doing it. If you expect it of them, they can do it. And these teachers just, I see it, they're like, they baby them, like,
It's been so dumbed down.
yes, yes, it's very sad. So I will not be subbing at middle schools again, probably. It was just not, I couldn't run fast enough out of that building then. It's
Wow.
like,
If any of you have, any idea of somebody needing, a job?
oh, thanks.
Somebody needs a job.
Yeah. I thought the first graders were so needy, but
Yeah.
I'd first grade any day after over
Mhm.
these. Yeah, it's just very, very disrespectful.
Yeah, seriously, we all should be praying for a job to
Thank
open up
you.
for Karen. And
I've even had
No, that's-
recruiters tell me it's brutal out there. It's really, that's hard.
I'm sure it's a very, very uncomfortable situation.
I mean, subbing doesn't make a lot, but it's better than nothing, so.
Yeah, oh,
And
absolutely.
it's making me really, not that I didn't appreciate teachers already, but
What was your, job that was?
I'm a technical writer.
Technical.
Yeah.
That's right. I knew it was some kind of writing.
I was working in cybersecurity for many years, so that's kind of, I don't have to stay in that area, but I'd rather not actually.
Well, thank you, Karen. Any questions or comments for Karen? Thank you for your presentation. Yeah, really appreciate it. Very, very insightful article. And there were several points that I marked here. He says, the author says that the newer system regards morality, it's talking about, the changing values and whatever, in Western civilization. The newer system regards morality as flexible and also not only flexible, but unnatural.
Oh.
Well, it is, but that's the challenge of life, isn't it? And in modern education, C.S. Lewis warns, aims to produce men without chests. In other words, people who can't think rationally, clearly, morally. Instead, we're very emotion driven. The desires and passions of the gut need to be mastered by reason and knowledge of the head. Classical education sought to improve the heart, the sentiments and passions which bring appetite into conformity with right reason. And morality abhors a vacuum. If children are not taught to discover objective right and wrong, they'll create their own value.
And I had also, but I didn't include it, didn't have enough time, but William Bennett, the
Mhm.
under Ronald Reagan.
Secretary of Education, wasn't he?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
he
think
has a
so.
whole list of great books to
Yeah.
read to learn about the honesty of Abe Lincoln or the courage of Harriet Tubman, and he had all these.
All the virtues. If we don't
Yeah,
state children's
that's
virtues,
right.
they're not
That's right.
going to get it.
And the
And
ben- yeah.
even the ancient Greeks knew that you couldn't have men governing men unless you shape the virtues from the time they're born.
And stories are a great way to do that.
Definitely.
So children.
And that's why he started out with some of the stories that he went to, right? So he moved from some of the apologetics into some of the stories. The language and
For the
order
kids.
series and
Mhm,
the
mhm.
space trilogy.
Mhm.
things like that. So the stories, if you can explain the exact same concept.
And then I'll end with this short paragraph on page 59 at the top of the page, left-hand column. Between the 19th century and the 1950s, so roughly that 150-year period, The American university was gradually being transformed from an institution intended to transmit knowledge into an institution designed to serve technocracy. And this comes from Ross Douthat. He says religious foundations were stripped away because they don't matter, you know, in a society that is all about expressing oneself in a subjective way. Religious foundations were stripped away. Classical curriculums were replaced by specialized majors, and professors transitioned from instruction to research. As a result, the university lost the traditional sense of community mission and moral purpose. And then he goes on to talk about how things went even a step or two further in that direction in the 1960s. So he's just talking about, you know, through the 50s. That was the trend. So again, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Yeah. So yes, Bruce.
Coach Lewis, you know, his level of experience with the UK, but he certainly was alive long enough. You know, all the stuff that flowed out of Germany after the war, you know, from the Frankfurt School and from, I mean, we know how he got to America, which he came into the New School in New York and so forth and so on, and that, and pretty soon we had the neo-Marxists in America, marched through the institutions and so forth. But how did that stuff, had that stuff affected England in time for Lewis to see it? Or, and I'm not sure how it got, did some of the Franklin School people go to England or?
Well, some did actually. And here's a bunch of hardcore Marxists, German Marxists. And when Hitler comes in, of course, the Nazis portrayed themselves as the saviors of German civilization against the communists. So they ran out all the hardcore communists in the German universities. But think about it, these hardcore Marxists, they have an option. They can leave Germany and flee to the east to the socialist paradise that's the Soviet Union, or they can go to the decadent West. They all fled to the West, to Great Britain and the United States as well. And so just, you know, gross hypocrisy, but, you know, we wouldn't expect anything else. So, yeah. Well, next week, we will start on page 22 in your study guide, and we'll take a session or two on natural law, politics, and the good society. And a lot of this is taken from this book I wrote, C.S. Lewis on Politics, Government, and the Good Society. We have a few copies here if anybody would like, if somebody doesn't have a copy and would like one. And those of you online, you can easily order this on Amazon. And you could probably get the book by next Wednesday if you went ahead and ordered it. I think online it's $14.95. And so even though it's very thin, it's only about 80 pages or something, 70 or 80 pages, but there's an awful lot of content in the book. And again, many people don't realize that C.S. Lewis was just a very, very astute political philosopher, along with all of his other great gifts and all. So very much looking forward to it. Thanks for your presentations, and very excellent. And so we'll have to do this in the next course that comes along as well. So thanks, blessings on the rest of your week, and look forward to continuing our study. We have about 6 or 7 more sessions in this course. So try not to miss a single one if that's possible. And hopefully we'll have better weather conditions going forward as well. So thank you. Great to see those of you online as well. Blessings on the rest of your week. And so looking forward to continuing our study. Scott, I see you there, and Wayman, Paul and Donna, of course, and Carol, Margarita, Jim. Yeah, Jim, good to see you. And Greg, yeah. Great to see Greg and Lisa as well. And of course, thank you, Andrea, for hosting our sessions.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Jeffrey.